Snowden, the one who has been the main person in this movie to be joining us late in the evening. So thanks for being with us, Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
You realize that people, I think, not only congratulate the movie, but also yourself as a person, as a whistleblower. And therefore, I'd like to perhaps start with a question. You once said that the worst thing could be that nothing will change or nothing will happen. So after more or less 3 years since you revealed these information to the brave journalists who met you, do you think that something happened or changed?
I do. I mean, there are many different ways of looking at this. The sort of instinctive way is we go, well, mass surveillance still exists, so nothing changed, we didn't fix the problem, right? But this is a little bit of a misunderstanding about why I came forward. I didn't come forward to tell people how to live or what to do. The problem of 2013 was not one specifically of surveillance, but one of democracy. It was the fact that our laws had changed, the operation of our governments had changed, around the world, across borders, and it happened without our knowledge, without our consent. Now, the basic principle of democracy in an open, Western, liberal society, one would hope at least, is that the government governs because they have a mandate that's based on the consent of the governed. If we don't know what's going on, we can't give our consent. Now, this isn't to say that we need to know the operations of every single program, that we need to know the names of every terrorist target. No one thinks we do. But when we're substituting the judgment of a very few people behind closed doors, this is actually changing the boundaries of our rights. It's reshaping the way that our governments operate, our militaries operate, even our police and our ordinary communities operate. In the United States, this is becoming very apparent because surveillance capabilities once were the exclusive preserve of the top intelligence agencies of the world. I'm talking about CIA, NSA, and so on, have trickled down to the fact that regular police now are using them, and they're concealing them from courts. Saying that they have a confidential informant that says they found this suspect or they think this person did that, did the other. But in reality, it's a surveillance system that's doing this. It's spying that's doing this. So the primary way that things have changed is that now we know. And now we sort of broadly, the public, at least have a chance to express our feelings. We have a chance to vote. We have a chance to debate where the boundaries should really be about this. This isn't about being for or against surveillance. This is about being for citizens and citizens' rights. Ultimately, I think it's not enough for us to live in a country where we accept a government. We can live with the government. We should be partner to government. And I think this is something increasingly that people are beginning to feel a little bit of a disconnect about. But when we see what's going on, when the government trusts us, the public, to have sort of a role in this conversation, we see that things start to change. In March of 2013, 3 months before I came forward and gave that first interview to The Guardian, the Supreme Court of the United States was hearing a case about these mass surveillance programs that had been alleged to exist by human rights organizations. But the court said you can't prove this surveillance exists. Therefore, even though these programs seem to be unlawful, even though this seems to be something that the court should have a say in determining whether this program should continue, the government can simply say it's secret, and the court must accept the government's claim. After June of 2013, after that first interview, the courts reheard the case, and they ruled against the government, restricting the surveillance powers of the intelligence community in the United States for the first time in more than 40 years. The President of the United States, who originally was against these programs, or against this publication, this journalism, said, in fact, this debate has made us stronger as a nation. Wow, he can't condone what I did. And the Congress itself, that initially very aggressively responded, called me a terrorist and a traitor and many other things, they themselves passed a new law codifying sort of the guidance of the courts. We've seen this in a few countries. We've seen some positive progress in the interpretation of international law and how that applies to sort of treaties and agreements. For example, the Safe Harbor Agreement was struck down on the basis of the U.S. intelligence community's powers. The way the laws are written provided no meaningful protections for EU citizens, and yet a paradigm had been provided that allowed companies to take data about the lives of EU citizens and pass them to U.S. companies where they receive no protection. Unfortunately, that's the case today. But I guess what I want to say there is just, it's very easy to think that small things changed. But it is changing. It's not changing fast enough. We haven't done enough, and the problem isn't solved. But now we have a place to start.
Thank you. I come back to the point of safe harbor, which you mentioned. So getting into what has actually changed, you mentioned that this has been taken down as data transfer agreement with the United States due to the mass surveillance in place. Now we just have the situation that the new decision has been adopted, so the data will flow again. Although obviously there's for sure still quite a lot of improvements to be done when it comes to surveillance. And in particular, one of the reasons why the new decision was adopted was because the US government has said there's no mass surveillance anymore in place. They do targeted surveillance now. So if you hear that, is this the right impression they send if they say now with the new safeguards in place they are not like surveying everyone anymore?
No, it's categorically untrue, and this comes down to how do they do this, right? Because governments don't like to hold themselves out as direct liars, saying something that's trivially falsifiable. So how do they get around this? How do they make a false claim without being held to account by journalists for making a false claim? There are two ways. One, you keep all the programs secret so nobody knows what's actually going on. That is the case here, but that's not actually the primary mechanism that they're using. The primary mechanism that they're using is language. They're denying that they do mass surveillance. They're saying, but we do bulk collection, which is something in their world that is entirely different. But in reality, in our world, right now, everyone sitting in this theater, it is mass surveillance. Bulk collection is affecting you right now. If you have a cell phone in your pocket, a record of it is being made. It's being stored with local telecommunications providers for increasing periods of time, long beyond any sort of reasonable business requirements. And these are either being voluntarily shared, as is in the case in the United States, often far beyond what is required by law. These companies they believe in the government, they identify with the government in a sort of nationalistic way. And in many cases, this is understandable, right? You want to see sort of be on the winning team. And government has contracts, government has money, they have a very solid reputation in most cases. Whereas the individual human rights, that's not going to get you a lot of business. Now, this isn't to criticize business. This is just to sort of understand their perspective. It's a very rational decision for them to overshare voluntarily with governments this kind of data. It furthers their interests. But what does this actually mean, right? So in the United States, of course, we have all of these mass surveillance programs. Let's amend this to the government's language so it's more clear. Bulk collection programs. This means when any of your communications travel over a US internet network, for example, through major US telecommunications providers, AT&T, Verizon, or an internet company, Facebook or Google, suddenly your legal protections no longer apply as they traditionally did, or as an EU lawmaker might expect them to. But rather they're handled through these sort of clandestine and secretive US policy interpretations. So we have this program in the United States called PRISM that became fairly well known because it involved the largest internet companies in the world. Apple, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, all of these guys, including the projected soon-to-be Dropbox, created secret agreements with the NSA. They didn't actually know in all cases that it was directly with the NSA, instead it was going through the FBI. But what it meant was the US government had access to any data that was on any of their servers. If it was foreign American, they had to go to a court, they had to get a warrant. Now that might sound reassuring, but they didn't go to a normal court. They went to a secret court called the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Now, in more than 33 years of processing these government requests, and this is for Americans, mind you, not foreign citizens, primarily, the government asked for permission to sort of do these sort of surveillance requests, to get secret warrants, and they were asked about 34,000 times. And of those 34,000 times, this court only said no 11 times. In 33 years. That's what we call a rubber stamp court. It doesn't really matter what they ask or how they ask it. They can just change a little bit of paperwork. If the court says no, the court will eventually say yes. But this raises a big question of, okay, what about for people who are not Americans? What about all the people sitting in this room right now in Brussels? Well, the bad news is that no warrant was required to access your communications. Even though under your laws it might be, under US laws, and this is still the case, no warrant is required. Rather, the Attorney General of the United States, the Department of Justice, as we call it, sort of our top lawyer for the government, signs a self-certification under a law called the FISA Amendments Act. Now, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, and this is very detailed, more than you need probably, but basically what it says is that the Attorney General can sign an order saying if an intelligence agent suspects that any of these companies have information that's interesting, it's of intelligence value to the government of the United States, they can access this information about foreign nationals, that would be you, without a warrant. So instead they simply go to Google, they go to Facebook, they provide this sort of self-certification by the executive branch of the government, not the courts, that says we want everything in your Gmail account, we want everything in your Facebook account. We want to see your corporate documents in Dropbox or whatever, because we think it's going to be related to a trade agreement that could implicate US economic interests. And these companies cannot refuse. But more critically, they do not refuse.
So regarding what you explain, these information now since 3 years since it has been revealed on the basis of your information, have been spread to the public, and people more and more perhaps understand also what is actually happening, and that this is the kind of mass surveillance which is taking place, and it's still. Having regard to the reaction, which at the beginning was very like outraged, and people were really angry about it, but now more and more also in Europe with the terrorist threat and all these debates going on, isn't there like the danger that people get used to this full take of their data online and their whole private communication? Do you feel that people get used to this as the standard, and how do you react to it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex topic, and it gets kind of in what we were previously discussing. The PRISM program, which we're talking about, the United States government would argue is a targeted surveillance program. They would say this doesn't implicate mass surveillance, even though they can access anything that's in Google, anything that's in Facebook. To them, that's not mass surveillance. That's not full collection, because they go, we're making individual requests. But there's, as you say, full take collection, which happens at the phone companies, where just as your signals are traveling back and forth, as you send an SMS message, as you type in a web address in your web browser, as you check your email, if the government intercepts these communications at the phone companies, which they're legally allowed to do under the laws of the United States, they may do this, and they may look through your communications specifically without a warrant, because you're not a U.S. citizen, as long as they consider it to be interesting. Now, again, this is well known, this is well established. The United States government does try to deny it by using different language, by saying, oh, it's not mass surveillance, it's bulk collection. But the facts here are clear, which gets us into the fact that we have to decide an effective means for changing this, if we want, in fact, that to be the case. Now, this isn't something for me to decide, but we can see that people are increasingly feeling disempowered because of the scale of the problems we're facing. Another very similar issue is climate change. We know the issues. The science is clear. There is no debate about whether or not this is actually happening. And yet governments seem completely incapable of responding to it. People increasingly accept that this is happening and there's nothing they can do about it, because despite all of their activism, despite all of their protests, nothing actually changes. We don't pass any laws that actually restructure this. Surveillance is very similar. And this is where we actually need government. We need elected representatives. We need the people in the room. We need journalists. We need people who have a platform to exercise leadership. Because the central issue here is there are things that the average person will never be able to invest enough time in to develop the expertise necessary to actually understand the kind of solutions that need to be proposed and then to implement them. They're also not particularly interesting in many cases. They're very technical, they're very dry. You can think about it in terms of food safety, right? Very few people are going to be interested about thinking about how food is delivered to the grocery store, how to do quality control to make sure it's safe and reasonable to have for sale, without specifically strict regulations on it or special checks or whatever. But government has to do this because it is necessary. What is at stake here is not just individual lives. It's not about where we get it wrong. where we hit the wrong company, where we bomb the wrong wedding party, where we arrest the wrong person and torture them or put them in indefinite detention, which has happened, right? These are not hypotheticals, these really occur. This is about the kind of society that we will live in. This is about the kind of society that our children will live in. And this is about the kind of values that we project to the rest of the world. We are telling people right now, today, through government policies that we are perpetuating and propagating, that it is okay to monitor every communication that every person makes without regard to whether or not they're actually suspected of any criminal activity. This is a very reassuring thing to hear in much more authoritarian countries. But this should be a deeply concerning thing to hear in our part of the world. And I guess I would turn the question around on you here and say, what should members of parliament be doing? What should member states be doing that you think they're not?
I think that's exactly what I would like to also go to, because we had just recently a new report of the Data Protection Authority in my member state in Germany about the activity of the intelligence service BND, and that there's also mass surveillance in place, mass collection, and which is for sure not in line with what the constitutional environment is about and the courts have said. And then we had just, I think today, revelations about new documents coming from your source on the GCHQ activities, having interceptions by satellite. Then we have also developments where intelligence capacities in France are enhanced due to the terrorist threats and the state of emergency. So if we talk about our activity here in the European Union, we see the governments acting in a certain way, while, for example, when we are doing something as a European Parliament, they are denying us having any influence on what they do on national security, which is a particular problem in the European Union. But even if national parliaments do certain investigations, for example, which is in the German parliament, the governing parties, which in a democracy also in many of our democracies also are a majority of the parliament, deny interference with the work of the intelligence. So somehow we're turning around since 3 years, also in the European Union. And what I ask myself is, what exactly do you think would help to create such a pressure to those governments and government parties to do a change, actually, to this?
The most important missing piece is the courts. We need courts to actually look at these programs, to allow challenges, in fact, to almost telegraph, to invite challenges to these programs, so that their lawfulness can be independently assessed. Right now, when we're trying to figure out if these programs are lawful or unlawful, we're often reliant upon nothing more substantial than the claims of the majority party in government, in whatever country happens to be running the program. And of course, they always say their programs are lawful. And they may believe them to be so, honestly, without presuming any bad faith. But we need more than that, because it's quite clear whenever a court does assess these programs that more often than not they find them to be unlawful. It's one thing to pass a law in a parliament. It's another thing to have a court actually assess them and find that they are appropriate, that they respect rights, that they don't go too far. That's the piece that we're really missing, and primarily because these programs are secret. They're being shielded not from the public at this point, because we all know they're occurring now, they're in the newspapers. They're being shielded from the courts, and that's quite a problem.
That's actually one point which I'd like to also come in again, because actually there are some court proceedings also in the European Union. Hopefully we will see more judgments to come in both highest courts, which is the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, on issues like data retention, but also on the case of GCHQ intelligence surveillance. So we can hope that this will create also some pressure on the majorities. What we did get as members of the European Parliament is a majority for a resolution calling on member states of the European Union to at least give the opportunity to you as a whistleblower to testify in one of the investigations and inquiries going on these mass surveillance issues by granting an asylum status to you as you are still residing without an opportunity to travel in Moscow. And actually this also was, I think it cited in the movie, that this was one of the decisions which we took in the European Parliament. Actually right now there is a debate going on whistleblower protection in the European Union. My political group in the European Parliament is proposing better legal protection to whistleblowers, as we have also other whistleblowers in other areas, like in tax evasion. So coming to this point and your status as a whistleblower, how do you see these issues developing when it comes to bringing information to people, as you were referring to? And have there been whistleblowers or people being inspired? And are you aware of other whistleblowers in this direction?
So I wouldn't speak about whistleblowers who are still anonymous, because having lived through the kind of retaliation that you're likely to face, it's not something that I would wish on anyone else. But I think the central question here is, what is the role of whistleblowers in society now, and what should it be? The unfortunate reality is, in that paradigm that we constructed a little bit earlier, where we have the executive function of government that actually does all the spying, they run the police and everything like that, hopefully for good purposes, right? But we don't actually know because it's secret. And then we have the courts that are being sort of shut out by this wall of secrecy. What happens when something in that executive branch of government happens to be illegal? How do you resolve that tension? How do you actually make sure the law is respected? If that wall of secrecy becomes impenetrable, if it can never be broken down, that executive function of government can do anything it wants. Its power, regardless of what it may be de jure in law, is unlimited in fact. Now, whistleblowers have been sort of modernity's response to this new wall of secrecy. They are a safety release for when the system fails comprehensively of oversight that may exist in government, where you're supposed to have some inspector general, some oversight body to keep the government honest, to make sure they're compliant with the law, but that office fails in responsibility. When legislators, when parliamentarians fail in their oversight responsibilities, because it's not politically beneficial, or they think it's too controversial, or they simply agree with the program's aims, even if it is unlawful. For example, how senators in the United States turned a blind eye to torture because they thought it was effective, even though they knew it was unlawful. Whistleblowers have been the way to resolve that, but unfortunately our policies, and this is not just in a single country, this is in countries around the world, lead to such a strong response, such a punitive response to whistleblowers, that we have very few of them. It seems to me that we need an international mechanism for arbitration for these individuals who believe they have witnessed some unlawful or unconstitutional activity, something that violates human rights or laws, that will allow these things to be evaluated on the basis of an international law perspective, because the individual nation whose secrets have been revealed will always be the least likely to be neutral in the arbitration of the actual claim. And this is where we start to see sort of international and multinational bodies of government have a unique function, I think, and role to play in the future of our governance. Because we have to remember that while governments are often pretty well run in many cases, they have policies that are well intentioned and put forward by people who are doing the right thing, they're ultimately comprised of people. And people make mistakes.
Perhaps as some kind of a last question to this, which is a bit more personal to you, do you think that in this regard there will be better conditions in the future also due to your case, and do you still believe that it would be possible in a certain future to testify in front of a committee in Europe or even in the US?
Well, I've already said that I'm willing to participate in any inquiry as an expert. I don't want to participate as a witness because I believe the testimonial role in this case should be served by journalists. I have never published a single secret document on my own because I believe the role of making those individual public interest determinations about what should be made public or not falls to reporters, to journalists, to institutions of the press. That is their role in society. So that's where I've been. I don't know if that will never change. It's not my intention. But we're missing independent experts in the process today. We have many lawyers who are talking about this. We have many activists who are willing and very expert in these issues on the human rights angle. But we have very few people who are willing to speak about how these intelligence operations actually work that aren't beholden to those intelligence agencies themselves. We've seen this, I think, in the German inquiry quite routinely, where intelligence officers on behalf of the German government say one thing, but documentary evidence says something completely different. We see this in the United Kingdom as well, where they say, we don't do mass surveillance. And then, of course, there's the story that was published just yesterday about their spy base that works in concert with the NSA, where it collects more than 300 million records in a 12-hour period. And that was like 5 years ago. So that number only increases with time. The US government will say we don't engage in economic espionage. The UK government will say everything that we do is overseen by law. We follow laws precisely. We don't break any rules. And every other member state in Europe says the same thing. But the private truths are increasingly divorced from the public claims of these officials. And we see this, again, in the kind of reporting. Now, I talked about the FISA court review, but this is a story that's gotten very little discussion in Europe about how the UK, the GCHQ, the British version of the NSA, specifically hacked Belgium's national telecommunications company. When you guys are making a phone call, the NSA and the British hear about it, even though they had lawful mechanisms for requesting this same information, they believed it was too cumbersome. So they thought it would be easier simply to violate the sovereignty of their partners, violate the laws, not only of their partners, but of every national or international law, because it was more effective. And this is a seductive idea that effectiveness equals propriety. But we have to focus on the fact that just because we can do something does not mean that we should. In the United States, of course, we say that we don't spy for economic purposes. We say that we don't spy on American citizens at all without a warrant. But there was a story in the New York Times, published on the basis of the NSA's own documents, that showed the NSA and its partners were spying on American lawyers that were representing, I believe it was Indonesia in this case, in trade negotiations. They weren't doing this because it would save lives. They weren't doing this because it would prevent an act of terrorism. They did it because they wanted a better price on a trade deal about shrimp and clove cigarettes. If we are willing to sacrifice sort of the lawfulness of our societies, of our international system, for a better price on shrimp and clove cigarettes, how meaningful are our laws, and how strongly entrenched are our rights?
Edward, I think that this question will now spur in the heads of these people who I have the feeling are moved not only by your story, but also by the facts which you revealed 3 years ago, and or which journalists revealed 3 years ago, and gained from your behavior, your actions, and I'm very thankful, and I think we are all to have the opportunity to talk to you so late in the evening. And I think I can also say we all hope that there will be changes in the future, and there will be new laws in place, and also better decisions made on the public, also because of what you have done. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sorry, if I could just say one last thing. I think Europe is a hope for the world. I think the European Union has something that many other governments don't have now. And we see that it's facing many challenges, particularly with the sort of divorce of the UK and all the other political problems. We have this rise of creeping authoritarianism in many countries around the world, not just the United States, but of course in many countries within Europe. But despite that, we have a kind of cooperation, a thoughtful analysis and reflection on serious issues that may be the only chance we have to temper the instincts of governments that are very much unchecked by a procedural need to build consensus. Governments that can simply push laws through very quickly without much resistance. And this was one of the primary reasons that I was so encouraged by the parliamentary resolution that was passed in the European Parliament regarding whistleblowers, right? It wasn't about me. Yes, it said that I should not be extradited to the United States, that the charges against me were political in nature, but that was not the most critical part of it. It was calling for the reform of whistleblower protection laws, for new laws in each member state that recognize the reality that if we don't have access to the truth, we don't have access to a meaningful vote. And this is really the bedrock of our society. You know, people think, many politicians, it's become fashionable in Europe to say, for example, in my case, you can't let this person into our country because it will harm the United States. They'll be angry. I don't think that's true. Because the United States is not a country that wants to see itself as harming whistleblowers, as fighting the truth. Yes, there are political incentives that say they should be strong here, they've created a deterrent here. But this is what everybody does when they get angry, when they stop thinking, when they have to respond forcefully and quickly. decision saying that they will protect whistleblowers even from their friends is not an act of hostility. That's an act of the greatest friendship. We need our friends the most, not when we're doing well, but when we're failing. And I hope that Europe will continue to work, not just to protect their own citizens, not just protect the rights of their own people, which of course is paramount now, but to remember that you occupy a unique position, not just in the world, but in history. And I think you are ultimately today's champions of human rights. And I'm very thankful for everything that you've done, and I hope you'll continue to work in the future. Because I gotta say, we need you now more than ever.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much. And thank you all again for coming, for being with us so late in your evening. And perhaps there is something also brought with this movie. Once again, I'd like to remind that, of course, on the movie, information shouldn't be or may not be spread before the 15th of September. But after 3 years, seeing no change, I think those days don't matter. So if after that time with this movie there comes new movement to